True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
George Kogan grew up in Puerto Rico before moving to New York City, where he would become a successful antiques and art dealer. In 1990, he was 49 years old, and he was happy for the first time in a while. He was planning a new life with his former publicist and current girlfriend, Mary-Louise Hawkins. But George's newfound happiness was very short-lived. One morning, while he was walking to his girlfriend's apartment, he was approached on the street and shot to death. Join us at the quiet end for Murdered for Money. Ever since George and Mary-Louise became involved, George's estranged wife, Barbara, was consumed with bitterness. As she and George worked out conditions of their divorce, Barbara became angry and very greedy, demanding even more alimony than George could possibly afford. Since Barbara stood to collect $4.3 million in life insurance upon George's death, she was the first person suspected in George's murder. But it would take investigators nearly 20 years to uncover a link between Barbara and the man who killed George, finally leading to an arrest.
So we have a New York beer for this case. It's called Glycerin, Pineapple and Raspberry, brewed by Hudson Valley Brewery. This is a fruited kettle sour, 8% alcohol by volume. I'm not a big sour drinker, but this was an excellent beer.
I am, and I love it.
You did like it?
I did.
I liked it too, but you're more of the sour person.
Absolutely. Those are my favorites by far.
It's a very striking beer. It's a hazy dark pink color with a light pink head, so it looks unique. Nice aroma, raspberry and pineapple, as was promised. Very sweet aroma. And a tart raspberry taste, some pineapple, and a lingering tartness.
Yum.
So we could drink this as often as you want.
Well, daily maybe, huh? Open up what we have so far and let's drink that. Okay, so I'm going to have you start us off as usual. This is really a fascinating case. At first I thought, well, it's pretty straightforward because it's just a murder for hire from a bitter wife. But
there's a lot of nuance to this.
Absolutely, there really is. So I thought it'd be interesting to talk about.
Let's do it.
Okay.
George Kogan was born in 1941 to Solomon Kaganovich, who's a Russian Jew, and his wife Ida, a Canadian from Toronto. So the most noteworthy thing about the day George was born was that Jews were ordered to wear the yellow Star of David. 1941, in Europe, not a good time to be a Jew.
No, that's horrifying.
Terrifying time.
Yeah, it really was. And his family went through a lot, and I'm sure that affected who he was as a person.
Has to,
yeah.
So the Kaganovich family was from Minsk, which is the capital and largest city in Belarus. Minsk had been a battlefront city, and many residents, including the Kaganovich family, evacuated to the west. As was common at the time for European arrivals, Solomon changed their names from Kaganovich to Kogan. Now, Puerto Rico, even though it was part of the United States, was not overwhelmed with foreign immigrants. The San Juan area, which is a major port and tourist resort of the West Indies, and the oldest city under a U.S. flag, was the only location where all 50 of the Kogans could go to live.
Yeah, it was a big extended family that came over.
I guess it was.
Yeah.
So Solomon traveled to Puerto Rico on behalf of the family, and he reported back to the rest of the family that they could buy a decent-sized piece of farmland in San Juan, not far from a growing tourist area, and everyone could be there together. And there's plenty of job opportunities. Port City's growing population of immigrant Jews would make them all feel welcome and at home as well.
Yeah, so while still on the U.S. mainland, Solomon and other members of the Kogan family began shipping wholesale merchandise through a partner in New York to Puerto Rico to sell for retail on the island. While in New York, Solomon had met, fallen in love with, and married a Canadian woman named Ida. Then the Kogans made their trip to Puerto Rico. They all reunited in San Juan. After Solomon and his siblings opened their first department store, the business really flourished, and the family built New York department stores into a chain of 9 stores. So the Kogans expanded the business and invested in property. George was one of 3 siblings, including an older brother, Lawrence, and a younger sister, Myrna. Now, even though they lived in Puerto Rico, after grade school, the children attended private preparatory and military schools on the East Coast, so they were very fortunate for this. Their parents wanted them to have the best education possible, which only the mainland could really provide at that time. George had a real head for economics and learned the retail business from the bottom up because he helped out in the stores, including working in the warehouse and unloading newly shipped-in merchandise. So once he reached high school age, George was sent to an East Coast military school, but when he returned during the holidays and summers, he would work at the family stores. So the next year, his sister was sent to a private boarding school in upstate New York. This was not far from the boys' academy where George attended. So these two were regularly able to get together, and they had a close relationship. Then, after high school, George enrolled at New York University. Since he'd had hands-on experience in running a store, his decision to leave Puerto Rico and expand his business knowledge was really supported by the entire family. Eventually, George wanted to become his own boss like his dad, and it was during George's time in college where he met Barbara, his future wife.
Barbara Siegel was born in 1943 to Emmanuel and Rose Siegel. Barbara grew up in the suburb of Morristown, New Jersey. There, in a 1950s middle-class community, the Siegels lived a simple life. They attended temple as a family on the Sabbath, and they went to school and synagogue together. While the family wasn't wealthy, Emmanuel earned a decent living, working at a small jewelry store he owned, and freelancing in the marketing for local publications. Barbara's parents worked hard and provided well for their 2 daughters. At Morristown High School, Barbara was active in the dance club. She loved performing, and her parents supported her. She continued performing after high school at Barnard College. That's a women's liberal arts college on the Columbia University campus. And she majored in art history. And in 1961, while still a college student, she got a dancing job in an off-Broadway show in New York City. So it looked like everything was going as planned for Barbara. She performed while working toward her college degree. She had dated a few classmates, but no one had become a serious person in her eyes.
No, not until she met a young college student named George Kogan. So he had moved to New York in the late 1950s to attend New York University. George then attended a theater production where Barbara performed, and he went backstage to introduce himself to her. At their first meeting, Barbara learned that George was a business major. But George was also interested in the arts, and they had a lot of the same interests. George asked Barbara out on a date that very same evening, and a few days later, he took her out to dinner in the city. So she was really flattered that George, who was a couple of years older, was interested in her. He was taken by her looks, of course. She was pretty, 5'5", with thick brown hair, darkish green-brown eyes, and a curvy figure. But George especially liked Barbara's easy smile and her calm, kind of, relaxing demeanor.
Laid back.
Laid back, that's a good way to put it. But George seemed to know what he wanted in life, and Barbara really liked that about him. To her, he seemed very worldly, which in a way he was. He'd done so much in his young life. Also, his business background impressed her. Because Barbara had plans. She didn't want to just be, a regular old housewife. She wanted to be successful.
Yeah, maybe the problem with that is that she wanted financial success. That's how she viewed success.
Yeah, a lot of it was financial that she was looking for, sure.
And that was good for her because George had learned how to make money from his father.
Absolutely, yeah.
So by the early 1960s, the Kogan family business was worth about $40 million.
It's a lot, especially in the 60s.
That's a good chunk.
Yeah.
So Barbara didn't know how wealthy the family was, but she could tell by George's gifts to her that he had money to spend. What Barbara also would not know until years later was that when she met George, he had been at school on a military deferment. And as soon as he left school, the deferment would end, and he would automatically be eligible for the draft, unless he married. So while George had not actively been looking to marry, it was at the back of his mind.
Yeah, and there'd been speculation that maybe he married Barbara sooner, or he was more likely to marry her at that time for that reason. Now soon George and Barbara began spending more time together, and between classes, George would often meet Barbara on Bernard's campus. They were comfortable with each other, and they took in some of the city's famous museums, including the Met. They shared a love of the arts and would eventually go on to sell paintings and other works together in their shops and galleries in San Juan and then in New York City. And besides art, they did have other similar interests. Barbara had a knack when it came to business, thanks to the time she'd spent helping out in her father's jewelry store. They also shared a love of fine furnishings and the history surrounding those types of pieces. Barbara's goals for her life were a college education, a husband, and a family, in that order. So since Barbara was adamant about earning her bachelor's degree, the couple did remain in New York until she graduated. But George dropped out before he finished. In 1964, 3 years after they met backstage at a Times Square theater, George and Barbara eloped to Virginia. So George really was the kind of man Barbara had always hoped to meet. He was educated, successful, from a wealthy, influential family, and pretty good looking. One of George's most endearing qualities was his love for his family, because he described for Barbara what it was like living in Puerto Rico, in that thriving tourist area of San Juan. He described to her its port, the harbor, and his family's rural farm. George eventually would relocate with Barbara to the island, and she'd only lived in New Jersey except for her time in New York while she was in college, so she was super excited about living a life somewhere new. Barbara and George settled in a nice apartment in the middle to upper class area just east of Old San Juan.
So very much in love and financially secure, the Kogans wanted to have a family of their own. They tried to have a baby, but they were unsuccessful, so they then decided to try private adoption. Their much-longed-for baby boy was born in New Jersey and arrived in 1966. George and Barbara named him Scott. And a month after the adoption, without the pressure on the couple to conceive, Barbara became pregnant with her second son, William Stewart, or Billy.
Barbara cared for the children, and with the help of a housekeeper and a nanny, she eventually went back to work as her husband's business partner. So for grade school, their sons attended public school. Then they went on to a Catholic prep school on the island. Over the next 20 years, George and Barbara lived the good life in San Juan. They raised their sons, they traveled, they invested in real estate, and they ran retail businesses. George continued working in his family's business as well. The couple also owned and operated London House, which was a high-end jewelry store. So the couple's relationship was more than a marriage. Barbara and George were a team, and together they built a good life for themselves and their family. But maybe they became more like business partners than having a real relationship.
Oh, that's certainly possible. But they were a good team.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they accomplished a lot, and their kids were happy. But in 1987, the couple moved back to New York. And 1 year after that, the Kogans sold the family's chain of 9 New York department stores. As one of Solomon's sons, George received a large share of the proceeds of this. But another reason George decided to return to New York was to be near his sister, Myrna Boris, who'd moved from the island to New Jersey many years earlier. Despite the distance between them, Myrna had maintained a really close relationship with her brother, and they shared regular phone calls from Puerto Rico to New Jersey. They visited also when George took business trips to the East Coast, but she didn't know Barbara very well. To her, Barbara was really not a warm person. Myrna witnessed her brother slowly grow apart from his wife as George immersed himself in his businesses, and Barbara worked in her boutiques and attended high society luncheons. Myrna first met her sister-in-law after Barbara and George's wedding in Virginia, but she and Barbara never formed a strong relationship. Barbara viewed the Kogans' move back to New York City as a new chapter in their life as a couple. Because their lives had been so busy, they'd really just been cohabitating more as friends than as a romantic couple. And Barbara looked at the relocation as a real opportunity to rekindle the spark in their marriage.
So it seems like, at least marriage-wise, things were a little off-kilter.
Yeah, they were growing apart. They'd been busy raising kids and running businesses, and I don't think they'd really had a lot of going on with the relationship as far as intimacy and friendship.
Yeah, they were just almost like two people that worked together.
Pretty much,
and
yeah.
happened to live in the same house.
It seemed to become that way, especially after their children were grown. But the Kogans settled on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, living off the money they'd made from the San Juan properties and businesses they'd sold. Then in June of 1988, they began searching for a property to open a high-end antiques, art, and jewelry store. So they found a prime location in the Madison Avenue area on East 76th Street. And in September of that year, they bought commercial space on the second floor. The Kogans were really optimistic that this location would pay off. They each had a lot of experience in retail, plus their shop would be a real draw for the Madison Avenue clientele. So the antiques business was really a natural fit for George with his family's history of running a chain of high-end department stores. And they would call this new store Kogan and Company.
Sounds good. So once the location was set, Barbara began looking for a public relations specialist to get out the word about the shop. They hired Matthew Evans, owner of Evans Communications, and Matthew appointed his employee, Mary-Louise Hawkins, to handle public relations for Kogan and Company. And Mary-Louise was well qualified for the job. She had a history degree with a focus on art from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Barbara instantly liked her and was impressed that Mary-Louise, the daughter of a wealthy owner of an oil retailing business, had studied ballet.
Yeah, because remember, Barbara was a dancer.
She was?
Yep, in her younger years.
Yeah. Well, and she did that through college.
Yeah.
So Mary-Louise was blonde, pretty, sophisticated, confident, and energetic, which impressed Barbara. Before taking her job with Evans Communications, Mary-Louise had worked for Matthew's mother, Mary Evans, who ran in high society circles in New York. Mary-Louise spearheaded publicity for Mary Evans' projects. Then at Kogan and Company, Mary-Louise's job was to raise awareness of the business by getting mentions and blurbs in newspapers and magazines, including gossip columns. Just Barbara, not George, had been working with Mary-Louise, although George and Mary-Louise had spoken once or twice on the phone. But they really didn't connect for some time. I mean, Mary-Louise and Barbara were the team working on the PR.
Yeah, and they really liked each other at that point. So for the grand opening, they invited neighboring shop owners and residents, as well as the media, to the store. So it was a really exciting day for the Kogans. That evening at the opening day party, Mary-Louise greeted visitors at the store's entrance. And during the party, Barbara approached Mary-Louise. She pointed out George, who was across the room, and said, "You have to meet my husband. He tells me he thinks you're attractive." Ooh, so this is the start of things, I guess.
Yeah, it's just kind of not a strange remark, but...
I think it's kind of strange to say to another woman about your own husband. A little. Now, Mary-Louise at the time thought it was odd, but she kind of brushed it off. I mean, it wasn't a big deal, of course, but just knowing what happens later, it's significant.
True.
So when she was introduced to George at the end of that evening, Mary-Louise thanked him for that compliment. "Well, I meant it," he said to her. She told him she was flattered. So that first meeting was really the beginning of a romance. From the very start, Kogan and Company, open 7 days a week, catered to New York's rich and famous. George and Barbara were really happy that the shop was off to a good start. But that ended up being short-lived. Just 10 days after their grand opening, on the morning of November 13th, Barbara asked her store manager, Leah, to report to the Kogans' apartment instead of the shop. And once at their apartment, Barbara let Leah go because she disagreed with Barbara about the store's rules. And George ended up blaming Barbara for this. Because after all, he said it was Barbara to whom the manager complained about the rules, which included asking clerks to use a basement bathroom. And he said this was a bad decision. It was discriminatory, and it really would embarrass and just, dispirit the employees. But that's kind of the way Barbara was. It doesn't put a good light on her. She put these rules into place anyway, and then decided to fire Leah. Barbara also informed the manager that she was firing the sales clerks as well. So now Barbara and George had to run the store themselves. And a short time after that, 2 of the employees who were minorities and the manager would file a discrimination lawsuit in federal court against the Kogans. And this cited 7 violations, including a breach of an oral contract. This complaint named both Barbara and George, but the employees singled out Barbara for asking them not to appear in the public areas of the store when customers were present and to use the bathroom in the basement instead of the one inside the shop. So this was very unappealing, not a good thing to do.
It's not a good look, that's
very
for sure.
Racist, yeah. So George ended up hiring an attorney, Martin Saberstein, with the law offices of Goodman and Saberstein, and on the Kogans' behalf, he countersued, asking that the court dismiss the case. But no decision would come for a couple of years, and I think it caused a lot of conflict between Barbara and George. Later, it would become clear that not just New York City employees had been unhappy with Barbara as a boss, because a former San Juan employee had a lot to say as well via a New York Daily News online discussion forum. So this San Juan employee called Barbara an entitled and difficult person.
Barbara was happy when George began to take an interest in the store's daily operation, including the public relations part, which she had handled in the past. She felt as much a partner in the couple's new business as she had in their earlier years in Puerto Rico. Mary-Louise often met with George in those early days to work out publicity strategies for the shop. From the outside, all seemed to be going well. So the Kogans relocated their living quarters to the Volney Hotel, which is between Madison and Fifth, just blocks from their antique store. But after living there for just 5 months, they realized they didn't need a 2-story apartment. So they sold that one at a profit and bought another Volney apartment, this one smaller, to be near their son Scott. But after a few months, the Kogans' business floundered. They had been optimistic about the shop, but the New York market turned out to be different from the resort clientele they had been used to in San Juan. In San Juan, the Kogans' businesses had thrived. Now, their Madison Avenue shop suffered, and the Kogans weren't prepared for that. They've been successful in pretty much every endeavor they've done.
Right.
And they had poured money into the store's inventory and invested in expensive improvements on the interior of the shop.
Yeah, I think it never really occurred to Barbara that they might lose money.
Yeah, no, I think I get the impression that it was just taken as faith that it was going to be successful.
Yeah, I think Barbara was just used to getting what she wanted all the time, and this was a hard blow, really. It was Mary-Louise's job as the lead publicist for Evans Communications to get some positive write-ups for the store. So she was able to get mentions in the New York Post's page 6 column and other tabloid gossip sections. Business increased and things seemed to get back on track, or at least Barbara thought so. And now Mary-Louise would regularly stop by the shop, and both Barbara and George enjoyed having her there. So George said this to his wife. He even went so far as to describe Mary-Louise as vivacious and attractive. Now Barbara still didn't think twice about these comments. In fact, she passed these compliments on to Mary-Louise, just as she had at the store's grand opening. Barbara even thought that Mary-Louise, only 26 years old at the time, might be a good match for her oldest son Scott, who was also single. He was only 22 and he was in college. So Barbara actually suggested to Mary-Louise that these two meet. Wouldn't it be nice to set them up on a date? Barbara asked George and a couple of their friends. So Scott and Mary-Louise met for a coffee, but there turned out to be no chemistry between these two, and they didn't even go on a second date. But around that same time, George and Mary-Louise were spending more and more time together to work on strategies to give Kogan and Company a larger public presence. So by that time, Mary-Louise might have already had her eyes on George. Barbara, though, hadn't given this a second thought because she really had no reason to distrust her husband. He'd never done anything in the past. He'd always been faithful. So she continued maintaining the store's day-to-day operations while George worked behind the scenes. He would do the purchasing of merchandise and he would oversee PR, which was what Mary-Louise was in charge of.
So he's kind of he's her boss, I know that, but he got an opportunity to work more closely with her.
Yeah, they were starting to have a relationship at some point here.
Yeah.
We just don't know exactly when.
The frequency of their meetings increased, and they began having lunches together after their meetings. And during one of their first lunch dates, George confided in Mary-Louise that he had been unhappy in his marriage for some time. He'd grown, evolved even, and for him the marriage had changed as he and Barbara grew apart, despite working together in their New York business. He'd done some soul-searching about his marriage, but he didn't want to try to save it. He told Mary-Louise he'd like to get to know her better and wondered if she'd be interested. So over the course of that lunch, George told Mary-Louise again that he found her attractive.
Yeah, she didn't refuse George either. She was flattered. Just like she was back at the grand opening party. But
Yeah.
that's how trusting and secure Barbara was in her relationship with her husband. She was really unaware that there was trouble in her marriage, although George felt so. So soon, lunches at the plaza turned into breakfast before work at Mary-Louise's apartment.
Uh-huh. Yep. So we do start with a meeting.
Yep.
Then we have a meeting and lunch.
Yeah.
And now we have a breakfast, meeting, and lunch.
Yeah, at her apartment, which means there's probably stuff going on, right?
Well, I don't know that.
I don't know it, but I'm pretty sure.
I'd be suspicious along that line.
I'd be surprised if they weren't physical by then. And the relationship progressed in mid-November 1988 when George invited Mary-Louise to join him on a business trip to Puerto Rico. Now, she hadn't been there before, so she really looked forward to having George show her around. George was already in love with Mary-Louise at this point, and she was very impressed with this worldly older man. They took long walks on the beach, and George really just swept Mary-Louise off her feet. Now, we know for sure that their relationship became physical on this trip. This was a romantic getaway, and it would be one of the things that would upset Barbara the most once she learned about the affair. So when George and Mary-Louise returned home, their relationship was stronger than ever, but Barbara still didn't really know that. Then, about a week after they returned from their trip, George reserved a room at the Plaza Hotel for Mary-Louise. He took her to it, and he told her, "If I come back tonight, it's because I've left Barbara and I'm coming to you. And if I don't come back, it's because I can't go through with it." So that evening, George returned to the Plaza Hotel and to Mary-Louise. That night was when Barbara learned that her husband had been having an affair with Mary-Louise. "I'm moving out," George had told her as he packed a bag, and Barbara was quite stunned. "Our marriage isn't working," he told her. "I'm in love with Mary-Louise." And as you can imagine, understandably, Barbara did not take this news well. She felt betrayed.
I'm sure she didn't take it.
No, because it wasn't only her husband betraying her, who she'd been married to for 24 years, but Mary-Louise, who she saw as a friend. She even kind of felt like a mentor to Mary-Louise.
Right.
So this was a lot for her to take.
In their whole marriage, she never once had any suspicion that he was having affairs or straying from the marriage.
No, I don't think he ever did.
All of a sudden, she's blindsided.
It was blindsided. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But George told her he didn't even want to discuss it. He'd made up his mind and there was no changing it. Before he left the apartment, he told his son Bill, who'd been staying with George and Barbara while he finished up college, that he would call him. But, Bill was angry too. He was angry that his father had cheated on his mother, understandably. So a bitterness toward George formed that evening, and it would continue and last for the next 18 months.
So while Mary-Louise and George celebrated being together, Barbara and Bill stayed at home, devastated by news of the affair and by George's abrupt move. Bill tried to comfort his mother, but he didn't understand what had happened. It all happened so fast. George had become infatuated with Mary-Louise, and the feeling apparently was mutual. Despite what was going on back home, Mary-Louise became George's main focus.
Absolutely, she did. Mary-Louise made George feel like a new man. She made him feel young. And for the first time in many years, he was really in love.
So what's the age difference? It's like 22?
About 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, although he was Jewish, he celebrated Christmas Day with Mary-Louise's family on Long Island. And that same month, he moved into Mary-Louise's East 69th Street Co-op, a brown brick 11-story apartment building. This was just steps from the subway, which was a convenient location for George. But having lost George so abruptly, especially to a woman she'd entrusted to do work for the Kogan store, was really more than Barbara could handle. On the day after Christmas, Barbara phoned Matthew Evans, Mary-Louise's boss. "Do you know that your employee is having an affair with my husband?" she asked. And he was pretty stunned and caught off guard.
I'll bet he was.
He told Barbara he'd look into it and get back to her, and that very same day he called Mary-Louise into his office and confronted her. Of course, he felt partially responsible because he'd been the one to assign Mary-Louise to the Kogan and Company account. Now, Mary-Louise admitted that her relationship with George was more than just business. She'd crossed the line, of course, and Matthew felt he had no choice but to let her go. So he also terminated his firm's contract with Kogan and Company. And shortly after, to ring in the new year and to help Mary-Louise through the disappointment of losing her job, George took her to Anguilla in the West Indies, where they spent 5 days relaxing together, another romantic getaway.
It certainly sounds like it.
So George was not going to be detoured. He just didn't care. He was in love, and that was it. Yep, that happens.
Then, during 3 weekends in January, George and Mary-Louise went to Miami Beach, Florida, and stayed at the Pritikin Longevity Center and Spa for a couple of days. And after that, they rented a nearby apartment on Palm Bay Court for an additional 12 days. So they were in love and certainly only thinking of themselves. However, during this time, Barbara was receiving the bills in the mail, and she was very aware of all the places George and Mary-Louise traveled to. She felt betrayed by both George and Mary-Louise, and even at times blamed herself because she'd been the one who hired Mary-Louise.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It happened. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I know.
But I'm sure she was very hurt. It's very bitter. It's a lot like Betty Broderick, You have to be bitter, and it's understandable. To a point. Not to the point of violence, in my opinion. But I certainly understand how she would feel really hurt by this.
Well, sure. I mean, here she is, married to this guy. They've worked as a team for all these years and have been quite successful together.
Yeah, she loved him, I'm sure.
And then crash. It all tumbles down.
Yeah, it's a lot to handle, but I think the real problem here was that Barbara also was very focused on money. And that's what would really lead to the tragedy here. Because she was angry, yes, she was bitter, but she also wanted money. And maybe that was her way of trying to get some kind of justice in this situation. So in February of 1989, Barbara filed for divorce from George. Officially, adultery was the reason given for the divorce. Barbara had papers served on her husband once he arrived home from vacationing with Mary-Louise, while he was sitting at a coffee shop around the corner from the apartment. The day before, Barbara had packed up George's clothes in suitcases, and she'd had them delivered to Mary-Louise's apartment lobby. Then Mary-Louise was served a court summons as well, a few days later, as she sat inside the same coffee shop. Barbara wanted Mary-Louise's statement about sharing rent with George, because Barbara was convinced that joint funds shared by the Kogans were being used to pay for that apartment. But it was later determined that Mary-Louise was living rent-free in this apartment because her father owned it. But now you have to think, Barbara lost not only her husband, but now she's lost the store. Per George's request, she stopped working at the shop, and George took over running it. Eventually, he closed it down temporarily. Then once his personal life had settled down, he reopened it. But for Barbara, life as she knew it had really ended, and she was very hurt. And this hurt would gradually turn to anger as the divorce proceedings grew very acrimonious.
Yeah, once George had separated from Barbara, he underwent a transformation, and this was noticeable to his friends and family. One friend interviewed by the New York Post after George's murder said he was happy. George and Mary-Louise were adorable, the friend told the paper. They told us they planned to get married. He always introduced her as his fiancée. One of George's cousins, raised in Puerto Rico with him, was pleasantly surprised with the positive change in George's demeanor. He and his wife had seen George walking in the city one evening with Mary-Louise holding her hand. He seemed so happy and full of life to them, not like the man who had been with Barbara for all those years. The difference was Mary-Louise's youth and beauty, to be sure, but George had also lost much of his preoccupation with money and business success. With Mary-Louise, he was enjoying the simpler things in life. But, the happier George became, the more bitter Barbara became, or seemed to be.
Well, I mean, I don't blame her in many ways because, sure, he's not preoccupied with money like he was, but things are different. He doesn't have to be. When she was starting out with him, they had to focus on money and they had to work hard. So, you can really understand why she's angry.
Sure.
Yeah. So in February, Barbara filed court papers asking for $5,000 a week in temporary alimony. Her attorney cited her $5,000 monthly American Express bill as supporting evidence that she needed that much per week to live. This alimony, her attorney wrote in the paperwork, was so she could continue living the lifestyle to which she'd become accustomed to during her marriage. Barbara's request for alimony, though, did not go well with the court. They felt it was excessive, and the first request was denied. And this was a difficult blow for Barbara. First, the court froze the couple's assets. Then Barbara's request for alimony was denied twice. So her life was changing in many ways she didn't want, and she was becoming even more and more distressed. So to represent his own interests, George, too, hired a high-powered divorce attorney. He successfully got Barbara cut out of their joint bank accounts, which was another blow to her. One thing the court did not address were the insurance policies the couple had taken out on George's life. So the judge didn't believe either party could pay the premiums because with their assets frozen by the court, they couldn't afford them. But this would turn out to be a fatal flaw in the Kogans' divorce and really in George's life.
So by 1990, the Kogans' divorce was still making its way through the court system. By then, Barbara had gone through 4 more attorneys because she just wasn't getting what she wanted or what she felt like she deserved. Then in September 1990, George's attorney filed a contempt of court motion against Barbara for violating the judge's orders, looting the couple's business, and continuing to sell the couple's joint property, much of which she'd gotten during her trips to the couple's former apartment in Puerto Rico while visiting her son Scott. If she violated the order again, the judge would hold her in contempt and fine her.
Until the financial dispute was settled and the divorce was final, Barbara, her friends said, depended on her mother, Rose Siegel, to send her money. George's divorce attorney eventually filed a statement with the court, telling the judge that George's net worth was somewhere between $2 to $3 million on the low side and $10 to $12 million on the high side. So that's a big difference.
Yeah, I wonder why they couldn't narrow it down a little bit more.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of it was real estate holdings in Puerto Rico and some in New York, so I guess they weren't able to get that down exactly at that point. Any money was tied up in real estate holdings and businesses.
Yeah, I can see that now. That's a little more fluid in terms of evaluating an apartment or a building.
Right. And despite the release to the court of George's worth, Barbara still believed her husband was hiding assets, which is possible. And she continued to feel she needed a lawyer in Puerto Rico to help her find those missing assets. And this might be where the real trouble started because Barbara hired attorney Manuel Martinez. She'd been looking for a divorce attorney on the island, and because Martinez was from Puerto Rico and had once practiced law there, Barbara thought he was the one to help her out. So Barbara walked into his office in Manhattan asking him to help her. She'd already started a list of the couple's assets, which included those life insurance policies that they'd taken out years earlier. So the couple had believed back during happier times that purchasing these policies was a sound decision to protect their businesses and ensure that Barbara and their sons were taken care of if anything happened to George. In an effort to acquire proof of those assets, on October 15, 1990, Barbara called State Mutual Companies asking if the 3 life insurance policies on her husband's life were still valid, and if so, who the beneficiaries were. Barbara would say that she needed the information because the main policy on George's life for $2 million had built up equity and was considered an asset. So a copy of the policy was the proof that Barbara needed for the divorce court. The other 2 policies were worth $1 million each, and Barbara had asked that a copy of each be overnighted to her via FedEx. Then Barbara immediately paid a $2,000 premium through a real estate escrow account to keep these policies active. So that's a little shady.
Well, not exactly shady, but you wonder
why is she paying
why
that?
She's doing that.
Yeah.
So that's $4 million.
Well, once he ends up dead, then it really looks shady.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just 8 days later, 9:30 in the morning, George walked to the market to pick up groceries for a late breakfast with Mary-Louise. Dressed in sweatpants and a T-shirt, he carried 2 bags from the food emporium back to his apartment. And as he turned the corner onto 69th Street towards home, Mary-Louise waited for him. Their home, where he'd lived with her for the past 2 years, was a new beginning for George. He passed the door to a doctor's office just 20 feet before the entrance to his building. He was walking quickly as a gunman suddenly came up behind him. With a gun in his hand, the killer rushed toward George and discharged 3 .44 caliber bullets into George's back at close range. George dropped to the ground, landing face down. Doorman Moses Crespo had been working at the building for more than 20 years. This morning, Moses had been sorting the mail, getting ready to put it into tenants' mailboxes, while a co-worker stood by to watch the door. He and the co-worker heard the pops as the gun was fired, but didn't realize it was gunshots, because it was the same sound they'd heard every day as construction workers used nail guns across the street. So he didn't think twice about the noise until his co-worker called out to him.
Yeah, a housekeeper had witnessed the shooting, and she yelled for the doorman to let her in. The doorman went to George's side. George asked for Mary-Louise right away and said that he knew he was dying. The doorman called 911, then went to get Mary-Louise. She was shocked to see George lying on the sidewalk in a pool of blood, and groceries and cash were strewn all around him. Mary-Louise didn't run to George, though. She stood frozen under the canopy about 10 feet away, pretty much immobilized by fear, I guess. At the scene of the crime, word spread in the neighborhood that there'd been a shooting. Mary-Louise still stood shocked, crying, as a doorman and a couple of other residents led her back inside the lobby. But before they let her back inside, Mary-Louise shouted, "It was the wife, his wife did it." And that statement, called out in raw emotion and heard by 2 witnesses, set the stage for what would become a nearly 20-year police investigation of Barbara Kogan.
George made it to the hospital alive, but unconscious.
And for the next 4 hours, the medical team operated on him. One of the high-caliber slugs had gone straight through his body, entering his back and exiting his chest. Doctors were able to remove one of the bullets that was lodged in his chest, but one stayed in. He suffered from penetrating injuries and ballistic trauma with massive blood loss. So once they went into surgery, doctors found that one of the bullets had actually punched a hole in George's heart.
Well, that's one way to have a massive blood loss.
Yeah, that sounds like that was probably the fatal shot.
Yeah, it's tough to survive one of those unless you get them immediately.
Right. Well, with him on the way to the hospital, Mary-Louise returned to her apartment and she called George's sister, Myrna. Mary-Louise, along with the doorman, took a cab to the hospital, and once there she called George's sons, Billy and Scott. So one by one, family arrived at the hospital. Myrna and her daughter, along with Mary-Louise's parents and Billy. Once at the hospital, Billy called his mother, Barbara, but she didn't answer the phone. "Mom, Dad's been shot. He's in the hospital. They're going to operate." Billy left a tearful message, and then he assured her he would keep her informed and asked her to meet him at the hospital. He also told her that Mary-Louise was there. So Billy tried calling his mother again later, but her answering machine picked up again. Barbara eventually returned his call, but she stayed home. "I don't think I should go, what with Mary-Louise there," Barbara told her son. "It might be uncomfortable."
Yeah, but this is her husband of 20-some years.
Yeah, and the father of her children. Yeah, I know. So the decision not to visit her dying husband would really come back to haunt Barbara. She'd later say that she'd been at home and in distress, screaming and in shock, and then fell asleep. But of course a lot of people didn't believe this, especially since Barbara's phone records showed that she spent a big part of that time making phone calls to other people.
There goes that story.
Yeah. Her divorce attorney, when contacted by a newspaper, said that for safety reasons, Barbara couldn't go to the hospital. She was in fear for her life because a gunman was still on the loose, and she too could be a target. So she was really upset that she couldn't be there. Hospital officials, though, would later say that they'd contacted Barbara several times and actually pleaded with her to get to the hospital because George wasn't doing well, and this could be the last time she'd be able to see him. But hospital officials would later say they'd contacted Barbara several times, pleading with her to visit the hospital because George was not doing well, and it could very well have been the last time she'd be able to see him. But despite their pleas, Barbara did stay home. She could have easily been there in minutes. At 11:38 a.m., about an hour and a half after the shooting, Barbara called her parents, Rose and Emmanuel Siegel, at their home in Puerto Rico. And the phone records showed this was a very short conversation. Barbara also called an unnamed friend who visited her at her apartment. And Barbara had asked her friend to do her hair in preparation for a trip to the hospital in case she decided to go. So this friend was a hairdresser, and Barbara actually invited her over to fix her hair while her husband was dying. Now, I understand they were estranged, but still, that's very cold.
But still.
Yeah.
So at the hospital, a couple hours after arriving, Mary-Louise left briefly to go home, take a shower, and change her clothes because she was planning to return to the waiting room to await news about George's condition. Now, in the late afternoon, the hospital called Barbara one final time. Her husband, George, had passed away just after 4 p.m. Doctors tried to revive him, but they were unsuccessful. They had done what they could, but with injuries and damage to his liver, lungs, and heart, George bled internally, and the bleeding couldn't be stopped. So 6 hours after the shooting, doctors in the ICU recovery room officially pronounced George Kogan dead.
So about an hour and a half after her husband's death at 5:30 p.m., Barbara called her friend Donna Cole in Norwich, New York. Barbara, according to Donna, was hysterical and not making any sense. Donna was surprised when Barbara asked if she knew the name of an attorney who had represented their mutual friend, Lou Ann Fratt, after Fratt had killed her husband and was prosecuted for the crime. Fratt, whose attorney had used a self-defense strategy, was later acquitted. So Barbara asked, "Do you know who her lawyer was in case I need one?" And this was, an hour and a half after his death.
Yes, she's lining things up, make sure she's covered.
Well, yeah, it shows you what she was thinking of, which was not him or her children. I mean, even if she hated him, she should be thinking of her children and how this was going to affect them, right?
You would think.
You would think. So George's body was taken to the New York City Medical Examiner's office. The next morning, his sister Myrna drove from her New Jersey home to Manhattan to meet Officer Joseph Giramonti, the first officer at the crime scene. So Giramonti, who could not reach Barbara, needed Myrna to positively identify her brother's body before the autopsy could be performed. Myrna was still processing losing her brother George, especially the violent way he died, which made it even more difficult for her. She still couldn't believe it. So Myrna, along with the rest of the family, would never fully recover from this loss that happened that morning when George was killed. After completing the autopsy, Dr. Charlotte filled out the death certificate and noted the cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds, and the manner, homicide. George Kogan's death became the 673rd homicide in 1990 in New York City. So that's quite a few homicides that year.
Yeah, it's still a ways to go till the end of the year.
True, right, yeah.
A ballistic and forensic firearms examiner with the New York Police Department's Firearms Analysis Section performed laboratory tests on a .44 caliber deformed slug removed during George's surgery and autopsy. One of the bullets George was shot with was a copper-jacketed hollow point .44 caliber. The hollow point is supposed to create more damage to the target that it hits. It also slows the bullet down so it doesn't overpenetrate and go through the target. So what that means is once inside the body, the hollow point bullets expand or kind of mushroom out and cause more tissue damage. The other slug removed from his body was the same, except it wasn't a hollow point round. So we fired a hollow point when it really did the damage.
Yeah, Don White, who was with the Bexar County Sheriff's Department's Homicide Investigation Division for 18 years, analyzed the circumstances surrounding the Kogan shooting. So if this was a contract hit, he said, the goal is 2 shots to the body and 1 to the head. But George had flown forward, so that wasn't possible. The final shot did appear to have been fired when George was already on the ground, which could explain why 2 bullets didn't exit his body because the ground may have prevented that. But as it turned out, ballistics tests were inconclusive, other than identifying the type of gun used to fire the bullets, because there was no murder weapon to compare the bullet fragments to. The unusual manufacturing process of the snub-nosed barrel leaves distinctive marks on each slug, but without the gun, of course, ballistic and forensic firearms examiners are at a dead end. Detectives did not have a suspect either, but they knew that the gunman was either a professional hitman or someone with a grudge against George Kogan. The shooting was definitely not random. Whoever had shot George had wanted him dead.
Yeah, he was the target.
Absolutely. So then the police put together a timeline surrounding George's murder. Although a thorough search was done, they were unable to find really any evidence at the scene. They were looking for a weapon that was used, some spent cartridges or spent rounds. But because the gunman had used a revolver, it would not have left behind any spent shell casings, because the casings would have remained inside the gun. But police didn't know that until the bullets were removed from George during his emergency surgery and during his autopsy.
So at 10:20 a.m., New York Police Department Sergeant Joe Fornabaio arrived to help with interviews. He interviewed Beverly Cantor, who had stepped out of her parked car to walk to a nearby market and saw the shooting just after it happened. She said that she looked up and saw a white male holding a gun. And shortly after Sergeant Fornabaio arrived on the scene, homicide detectives responded to the call at 10:25 a.m. They were there to interview more witnesses, including Moses Crespo, who relayed what he had seen. The detectives and their investigative team spent the day at the scene gathering what little evidence there was.
They spoke with witness Roger Weidman, a Federal Express delivery person. Weidman had just driven up and jumped out of his delivery truck. Suddenly, 3 or 4 shots rang out, he said. He immediately looked up and saw a thin white man about 5 foot 10 inches tall hurrying up 69th, then turning north onto 3rd Avenue. Weidman told NYPD detectives that the gunman wore a dark-colored trench coat and a neon-colored cap, and that his hands were near his waist area. Weidman walked toward the victim and saw that George was shot, but since others were starting to approach him too, he'd left the scene and continued his route, which I think is kind of weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a big deal, right? You don't just keep working.
Well,
but it's New York City,
gotta
so...
get that FedEx stuff delivered.
That's true. So near 68th Street and Lexington Avenue, Weidman saw a man, possibly the perp, running and looking back. So that's what he told the police. He said the man had headed toward Madison Avenue, where he got a closer look and a better description. He said the suspect was in his 40s, about 5 foot 11 inches tall, and weighed about 160 to 170 pounds. He also said he had the beginnings of a gray and brown beard, he wore dark glasses, and had not yet ditched the trench coat or bright-colored cap. Weidman knew that this was the same man he'd seen standing near the victim just a few minutes earlier.
And detectives also questioned Hector Agostini, who had been working as a repair person 2 doors up at the Fairfax luxury residences. He'd been on a break, standing just inside the lobby doors, when he heard what he told investigators were 4 shots. Then he saw a partially bearded man, about 40 to 45 years old, wearing glasses, a bright green Dayglow baseball cap, and a dark gray vest with light gray sleeves. This man was walking fast towards 3rd, according to the statement to police. He further observed this male place what appeared to be a handgun in his waistband. Now, Hector didn't observe where this male headed after hitting 3rd Avenue, according to the police report.
Well, at 5 p.m., Charles Hage, 27 years old, and in the city visiting his brother, called the NYPD's 19th precinct to tell police what he had seen earlier that day. Officer Steve Maluso, who'd been at the scene that morning, took the call. And Hage told Maluso that he'd happened to be standing on the northwest corner of 69th and 3rd just after 10 a.m. when he heard what sounded like 3 gunshots. Hage then saw a man running on 3rd Avenue away from the scene, and he also mentioned that the suspect had a reddish-gray beard and looked like he was carrying a Walkman. So, of course, one of the first questions a homicide detective asks is who would benefit from this murder. The answer in the Kogan case came 2 days after the murder, when an inquiry by investigators into George Kogan's insurance papers showed that his estranged wife Barbara was the main beneficiary of Kogan's $4.8 million insurance policies. So, for detectives, it served as potential circumstantial evidence and, of course, a motive for his murder.
Oh, very definitely.
A strong motive. Police then learned that George owned real estate in New York with a value of $1.85 million, assets considered community property in the Kogan's divorce proceeding. So this was in addition to the life insurance policies taken out on George's life, and it was left to Barbara. So this really made her the prime suspect.
Yeah, you're looking at $6.5 million.
Yeah, a lot of money.
Yeah. So Scott Kogan tried to talk to Barbara about funeral arrangements for his father, but he would later say she just wanted to talk about George's will.
Yeah, she wasn't even really careful or subtle about this.
Now, to Scott, his mother seemed overly preoccupied with finances. Scott and his brother Billy, as well as George's siblings, planned their father's funeral. At that early stage in the police investigation, detectives had started probing George's personal and financial life, looking into who might have wanted him dead. Detectives were there when George was laid to rest. Barbara Kogan sat up front between her sons Scott, 24, and Billy, 23. In the pew behind them were George's brother Lawrence, sister Myrna, and mother Ida. Missing from the service was George's live-in girlfriend of 2 years, Mary-Louise Hawkins. She'd been by George's side at the hospital and at his deathbed, but out of fear of a media frenzy, Mary-Louise stayed away from the funeral and burial. George's family understood her absence. Just as a footnote, Barbara's parents, Emmanuel and Rose, did not attend either.
Well, I mean, I do understand why the girlfriend wasn't there. Not just the media, but the whole situation, right?
Right.
But it's a little strange to me that Barbara's parents weren't there. I don't think they were close with George, but, you know, they were related to him for a long time. Their daughter was married to him and had his children. So that's kind of strange and not there to support Barbara either. So John Lyons, who'd recently been Barbara's male companion and friend, was at George's funeral. Lyons was sitting with lawyer Manuel Martinez, whom Barbara had hired just a couple of months back.
Yeah, this was the divorce attorney.
Yep. So Deputy DA Joel Schneidman would later question Barbara's behavior at her estranged husband's funeral. He said she played up the role of the grieving widow at the funeral, showing up in sunglasses, claiming to be grateful for the good years she had with George. And as time went on, he thought that Barbara had difficulty keeping up the facade of the grieving wife. So I'm not sure specifically what he meant by that, but it seems like she just did not give a good impression to many people, including her own children.
Well, she wasn't appropriately sad.
No. 2 years after George Kogan's death, all of Barbara's financial worries ended. She received the first of 2 life insurance payments from George's policies. Also in George's will, he had left her the legal minimum amount of money, 1/3 of his estate, including interest, and that would be paid out in installments for the rest of her life. Barbara alone was the beneficiary of his 3 life insurance policies, which were worth a total of $4.8 million. So in October 1991, while the SMA Insurance Company underwent its own investigation into George's death, the company reached an agreement with Barbara's attorney to make the partial payment of $2 million. So life appeared to be going pretty well for Barbara and her family, but money was still a motivating factor for her. She'd not given up trying to find the property that she and George had owned jointly to cash in on that.
Mary-Louise moved out of the apartment she had shared with George and relocated to a new condo. She eventually married and moved to the United Kingdom with a new husband. Authorities in New York stayed in touch with her, keeping her up to date on the murder investigation.
Yeah, she was, from the beginning, she was convinced that Barbara did this, was behind it.
Yeah.
And for years she would feel that way, really forever. In 1996, the remaining half of the insurance money that was held back during the SMA Insurance Company's investigation was also released to Barbara. So this would mark the end of the insurance case, which was formally closed because an investigator was unable to determine who was responsible for George's death. But, Barbara's life as a wealthy widow really didn't last long. In 1998, just 2 years after she had collected that final installment on the life insurance policies, she filed for bankruptcy.
So she blew through almost $5 million.
Seems like it, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that was when personal financial details provided in the public bankruptcy file were revealed about her lavish lifestyle after her husband's murder. So the bankruptcy court thought this was pretty shady, and they investigated Barbara because it was well known that she had inherited a large sum of money, and it seemed very odd to the court that just a few years later she was saying she was broke. So the court learned that Barbara had gone through the money quickly because of her very extravagant spending habits. And those habits, according to the bankruptcy court records, included 2 plastic surgeries that totaled $105,000.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
What did she have done? A whole new body?
Well, I know. That's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure
Especially
is.
in the 90s. Psychotherapy for $84,000. Renovated an apartment for $160,000, spent $83,000 on traveling, and over $100,000 on health and beauty spa visits. So she should have looked like a brand new woman. She also had spent thousands on a Hampton summer rental, but Barbara couldn't explain her failure to disclose her complete financial status, and she couldn't provide documentation. Barbara had lied, so this did not go over well with the court. She was hiding money. Even though she spent all that, she didn't spend $5 million.
So the court denied Barbara's bankruptcy, tossing out the case because she had omitted millions of dollars in assets. So like you said, she squirreled some extra away.
Yeah, she really wasn't a very honest or nice person, it turns out.
Now that same month, Barbara got more bad news when George's brother Lawrence took his former sister-in-law to court to recoup money he'd invested in the couple's businesses. Had Barbara's bankruptcy filing been approved, it would have protected her from creditors, including Lawrence. In his lawsuit, Lawrence stated that Barbara owed him several $100,000 from business deals Lawrence had had with George and Barbara. Lawrence Kogan's suit stated that his sister-in-law had received more than $4 million in insurance money, as well as hundreds of thousands of dollars in jewelry from her late husband's safe deposit boxes. Lawrence's filing also said that the Kogan and Company store had an inventory worth more than $1 million, and that Barbara Kogan had failed to account for that money in her bankruptcy hearing.
Yeah. So as the criminal investigation into George's homicide moved forward, these records would eventually become public. But not before Barbara had spent most of the insurance payout and didn't even have enough left for Lawrence to collect. So in 2003, Barbara met and married a new husband. By then she was in her 60s, and she met Bill Bodine and mistakenly thought that he was a wealthy man. She actually knew very little about Bodine other than him telling her that he was an investment advisor. She didn't know that Bill had been on probation when she met him. He had been sentenced in 1994 to 21 months in a federal prison, according to documents, for taking money from a high-ranking Libyan official.
Well, he and Barbara should get along pretty well then.
Well, you'd think so, but he didn't have what she wanted.
Or at least not enough of what she wanted.
Right. So by 2004, Barbara and Bill returned to Manhattan, where they stayed until mid-2005. But by that time, just 2 years into the marriage, their relationship was really on the rocks, and they began divorce proceedings. Barbara told her friends that she regretted remarrying, and then she would call her first husband, George, the love of her life. And she would really play on that, like, oh, George was the only man I really loved, and, we would have been happy, yada, yada.
Well, it's always good to rewrite history.
Yeah, I guess we all do it to a certain extent, but she was really good at it.
So as Barbara's trying to move on, a grand jury indicted her one-time lawyer, Manuel Martinez, for the murder of George Kogan. On June 26, 1996, a sealed, one-page, two-count indictment was signed charging Martinez with murder and criminal solicitation, both in the second degree. Martinez, unaware of the indictment, was sitting in a Mexican prison serving a jail term in an unrelated case. With the murder charge, New York City investigators had won their first indictment 8 years after George's murder. But it's going to take 11 more years before Martinez would be brought to the U.S. to face the murder charges.
Yeah, Carlos Piavanetti, a realtor renting space from Martinez, went to the authorities based on some comments that Martinez had made during a meeting. Carlos's testimony was later used as evidence against Martinez in the George Kogan murder trial. So the meeting in question happened in July of 1992, when Martinez went out for drinks with Carlos. Carlos was in the office before and after George Kogan was killed, and he saw Martinez's reaction firsthand. Carlos would later say he pressed for details about the Kogan case. For 2 years, Carlos had suspected that Martinez had knowledge about the case, especially after Martinez had imitated the way that George fell to the ground and held his hands to his chest. If we talk about it, Martinez told him, I don't ever want to discuss this with you again. You have to give me your word on that. So Martinez told Carlos that Mrs. Kogan came to him and told him that her husband had left her for a much younger woman and that he had left her with no money. Manuel Martinez had talked Barbara Kogan into this murder, convincing her it was the right thing to do because her husband wasn't giving her any money. So the alleged hitman was someone referred to as Paul Tony Pro Prosano, an acquaintance of Martinez. Carlos also said Martinez told him, remember the morning at the office that you got that call from Paulie? He called me and said, it's done. So Carlos didn't think about that restaurant conversation for a few months until September 15, 1992. That's when Martinez beeped him while Carlos was being questioned by the Westchester County Police about an unrelated fraud case. This was a case where checks were stolen from the county and Carlos was in on the scheme. So that beep came at an opportune time for Carlos. He told police he had information about the George Kogan murder. Carlos returned the page by phoning Martinez, and the conversation was tape recorded by the police as Carlos sat inside the Westchester DA's office. So it was Carlos's only opportunity to negotiate a queen for a day agreement between himself and the DA's office. In return, Carlos facilitated the taped conversation that directly linked Manuel Martinez to Prosano, paving the way for a murder indictment against Martinez. So the investigation had stalled because of uncooperative witnesses and jurisdictional roadblocks until the Westchester County DA's office stolen checks investigation led them to Carlos and to Martinez. So detectives learned that one of the fraudulent checks had been made out to a Joaquin Rios. Then detectives learned that Martinez, a notary public, had notarized a power of attorney document giving Carlos the right to cash checks endorsed by Joaquin Rios. So...
a good legal mind has come up with all these brilliant ideas.
Yeah, very complicated case, really.
So a stolen check made out to Joaquin Rios for $50,000 was traced back to a Westchester County bank account. Carlos was a clear suspect, and he was worried. The only way for him to lighten the 15-year sentence he was facing for the charge of fraud was to become a confidential informant. Then another break came to the police when they interviewed Martinez's ex-wife. She told them that Martinez had admitted to her, while they're still married, that he was involved in George Kogan's murder. Martinez had no prior American criminal record, but during his time living in Mexico, he'd been jailed in 2 different Mexican prisons after being convicted of drug-related charges.
Yeah, Martinez was offered a plea deal to testify against Barbara, but he refused. Then on March 17, 2007, Martinez was released from the federal maximum security prison in Toluca, Mexico, 40 miles southwest of Mexico City. He didn't know he was at risk of being deported or extradited because he was unaware of the indictment that had been handed down back in 1996. He did have dual citizenship in Mexico and the U.S., and felt he was protected by Mexican law from being deported. But in 2007, shortly after Martinez's release from the Mexican prison, a New York law enforcement officer, armed with the 1996 indictment for George Kogan's murder, arrived in Mexico. Days later, at 3:30 in the morning on March 22nd, Martinez was taken into custody. So in this case paperwork, he was classified as a violent felony offender and a flight risk. With Martinez's sentence served out in Mexico, U.S. feds escorted him back to New York, and that's when he was jailed at Rikers Island.
Martinez was convicted at trial. With the conviction of Martinez came the final break in the case against Barbara Kogan. 2 key witnesses testified at Martinez's trial that he not only confessed to them, but he had also implicated Barbara Kogan as a co-conspirator in the hiring of a hitman in George Kogan's slaying. Now, with the Martinez trial completed, prosecutor Joel Seidemann had the probable cause needed to indict Barbara.
Yeah, so in 2008, investigators finally closed in on Barbara. By this time, she'd started her own company, and she called it Clementine Holding Corporation. She needed to continue earning a living at this point. She was spending thousands a week on her attorney, and she'd cut back drastically on her other spending. 20 days before Barbara's arrest, the court record showed that the prosecution had filed a voluntary discovery document in the case of the people of the state of New York versus Barbara Kogan. And on the disclosure form, the DA wrote that the prosecution had scientific and medical experts, including ballistics, serology, fingerprints, and medical examiners' reports. The prosecution also included photos and drawings, as well as tapes and electronic recordings. Barbara knew from her attorney that he was expecting her to be indicted. But just before Barbara's arrest, her good friend, Donna Cole, was in the city. Donna was staying at her Manhattan apartment, which was a second home for her. Barbara, who was still living in her East 55th Street apartment, wanted to talk. So on a Sunday afternoon, she went to Donna's apartment, and Barbara threatened suicide. She was so upset that Donna was frightened for her. So Donna actually worked at a Binghamton hospital and talked Barbara into going home with her to New York. So once they arrived, Donna took Barbara to the psychiatric ward where Barbara checked in as an outpatient. The pressure had just become too much for Barbara, and Donna took her to the hospital again. This time Barbara was admitted involuntarily as a psych patient, and the closer her arrest grew, the more unhinged she became.
On November 21st, the director of the hospital handed over Barbara's passport to the authorities in order to prevent her from fleeing. Then on November 25th, 2008, Barbara and the director arrived at the New York County District Attorney's office so that Barbara could turn herself in. She did that, and she was officially arrested and charged with a single felony count of murder. So Barbara stayed in one of Riker Island's 10 prisons until December 2nd, when she was placed on suicide watch and relocated to the Elmhurst Hospital prison ward in Queens, New York. Then eventually, Barbara was transferred back to jail at Rikers, where 1,100 detained female adults and adolescents were housed. But Barbara was placed in protective custody, where she was locked away and segregated 23 hours a day, so that corrections officers could keep an eye on her and prevent her from a suicide attempt. So during this time that she was in solitary, she was isolated from the outside world.
Yeah, she was denied bail and held over for trial after she pleaded not guilty. The contract killer in the George Kogan murder has never been arrested. But despite that, prosecutors said that Barbara hired Manuel Martinez for $100,000 and that Martinez in turn had hired Paul Persano to carry out the murder for $50,000. Publicly fingering a man for a crime but not charging and prosecuting him was really a bold move by the DA's office. But it didn't stop them from charging Martinez with hiring the supposed hitman or from leaking to the press Paul Persano's name. Persano and Joseph McKee were arrested in January 1996, and they were charged with kidnapping, burglary, and armed robbery. Persano was identified as carrying a gun, and this gun had been suspected to be the same weapon used to kill George Kogan, although no solid evidence was ever presented because this gun was never located.
So authorities said that he was carrying a gun, but he wasn't.
Well, he was carrying a gun, but they never got a hold of it
to
use it for comparison.
Got it.
And they never were able to arrest him.
No.
So the night before her May 1st, 2010 trial, Barbara pleaded guilty at a hearing where the media was not there. So this was a surprise hearing that no one, including the media, had expected. Barbara admitted to what she had denied for nearly 20 years, that she had played a role in her husband's murder. Barbara and her lawyer had learned that prosecutors had recordings of Barbara having conversations with a friend on the jailhouse phone. Those taped conversations, authorities said, implicated her. The recordings spanned her 18-month isolated incarceration at the women's jail on Rikers Island. Details of the recordings were not made public, but both sides, the defense and the prosecution, had listened to these tapes, and what they'd heard was passed on to Barbara, so it certainly hadn't been good for her.
Must not have been. So for the first time since her indictment in 2008, Barbara took the stand to plead guilty for her role in her husband's murder that occurred 19 years earlier. The judge explained waivers to Barbara, then reminded her that she was under oath. When she took the stand, she seemed calm and resigned. She told the judge that Martinez told her he was going to hire a hitman and that she had agreed to that. She said that she and Martinez had traveled together to Puerto Rico to get $100,000 from her father to pay for the hit.
Yeah, so that makes me think her parents knew what was going on, which is really shocking to me.
Yeah, if that's true, that she was asking her dad for the money, yeah.
Yeah, and then her estranged husband ends up dead. And remember, the parents didn't go to George's funeral, which I find very interesting.
So with Barbara's statement, the police and district attorney's office had probable cause to pursue John Lyons as a person of interest in the murder because of his alleged knowledge of the hitman's identity and his actions in contacting the insurance company about George Kogan's life insurance policies.
Yeah, he'd been Barbara's boyfriend, remember, and he had made calls and been involved in that, So at this hearing, the judge dropped the first-degree murder charge against Barbara, and she pleaded guilty to a Class B felony charge of first-degree manslaughter, plus second-degree conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree grand larceny. She was sentenced to 24 years for manslaughter and 4 to 12 years for conspiracy. So Barbara was promised that she would serve no more than a total of 10 years in prison before she would be eligible for parole, because of the 2 years credit she was receiving for the time spent in custody since her arrest. It meant she would be out of prison no later than 2020, at the age of 77. Now, by contrast, a jury convicted Manuel Martinez of second-degree murder, with the judge handing him a 25 to life sentence.
Police would not say publicly if an investigation of John Lyons was begun after Barbara's incriminating statements in court. But by mid-2011, no investigation into Lyons' role had been opened by the NYPD or the DA.
Yeah, Barbara's telephone conversations taped at Rikers were sealed and never made public. Apparently, though, the recorded conversations were the final straw that drove Barbara, who once adamantly and confidently told reporters I didn't do it, to fold and to take the plea deal.
That must have been pretty damning.
Yeah, I can imagine. I'd love to hear them. Her attorney requested that she remain in protective custody in prison, but the judge denied that request, so she was moved to the general population, where she'd be treated like any other prisoner.
Barbara Kogan was released on parole in November of 2020. When she was 77 years old.
She returned to Manhattan and is under supervision of the state's New York County Parole Division.
Yeah, she's an animal. Mary-Louise Hawkins told the New York Post after parole was approved, Barbara is extremely good at manipulating people, even parole officers.
Yeah, so true story, I'd guess. I'd agree with Mary-Louise on that.
I think she's probably on point there.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of this story, I felt like, well, she was a woman wronged. And I could kind of see how she'd be hurt and upset. And she did deserve some money. But I just think she got so greedy and really became such a cold person. Or she was cold all along, I don't know. But really just seemed like a bad person in the end.
Well, it seems that as long as she was married to George and enjoying all the luxuries that came with, not with him necessarily, but with his lifestyle, she can be overlooked.
Yeah, I think she wanted what she wanted, and that was it pretty much. And, the marriage kind of started out that way. We did talk about how she wanted someone who had money.
Right.
Right?
That was one of her dreams.
Yeah, it was her criteria, really, for a husband. And then, on the other side, he kind of married her to avoid the draft as well. Although I think he definitely did love her, and she probably loved him at some point to the point someone like that is able to love.
Yeah, I just don't see how that's a solution. She gets divorced and goes through a lot of difficulties with the divorce, but still, why kill him?
Well, we know why, to get all the money.
Yeah.
She wasn't going to be satisfied to watch him be happy and she not have everything she wanted. And she really didn't think of her children in this either.
No, she didn't.
No, she really didn't.
I would bet you that even if she had been getting the $5,000 a week alimony that she was requesting, that still wouldn't have made her happy. She'd be looking for more.
Yeah, I agree. I think she definitely would. Okay. Well, before we move on to feedback, which is a really interesting one today, we're going to do some talking about Lucy Letby and the Menendez brothers. So 2 very hot topics, I believe. Let's just remind our listeners about our premium option of TCB, where you can get early, bonus shows, and ad-free shows. You also get a gift and a thank you note from us if you subscribe. We do a bonus show at least once a month, and we really enjoy doing those. Plus, we release our regular episodes a day early and without ads for our members. So if you're interested in this, we do appreciate our supporters very much. You can subscribe at tiegrabber.com/subscribe, or if you prefer, you can get the same benefits through Patreon at patreon.com/tiegrabber. Some other ways I'd ask you to support the show are to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen to us. If you do have a case suggestion for us to cover, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, and voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website, and you can record your voicemail right on your device, and it will go right to us.
It's time for listener feedback.
And what have we got for feedback?
Right, as you said, we have a lot to discuss about the Lucy Letby case.
Okay, so let's start out with our email from Ian then.
Yeah, because he's going to set the tone for the discussion, and some of the things I would have spoken about he covers in his letter.
So Ian writes, "Thank you for your good YouTube video about this case. Very many high-profile people here in the UK are speaking out that this is a huge miscarriage of justice. A very good article, which hopefully you can find on the internet, is Guardian. Lucy Letby killer or coincidence?
Yeah, he meant the Guardian newspaper.
Okay. Why some experts question the evidence. Lots of new revelations are coming out, including that her so-called confession notes were written as part of counseling therapy, and that she was having that from the hospital after she'd been bullied off the unit by the lying, scapegoating doctors. So that's strong language. These doctors are guilty of medical negligence, and by scapegoating Lucy, they have got off so far scot-free. Also, the hospital does not have to pay out huge amounts of money in medical negligence claims. Lucy has been scapegoated and stitched up. Dr. Dewey Evans is a charlatan who has a long history of giving wrong and deeply flawed medical evidence and scandals. Top leading neonatologists have stated in the above-mentioned article that dodgy Evans' theory that LL, Lucy Letby, injected air into the babies to murder them is ridiculous and implausible. You might like to research the similar wrongful convictions of UK's Sally Clark and Dutch nurse Lucia de Burke. So I am familiar with those cases. We did look at those. I don't know if I'm ready to go so far as to say the doctors were scapegoating her on purpose. Not sure about that. They might...
That's a little bit of a difficult statement to make, I think.
Well, I think they might actually believe that they're right, and they're not just trying to get her in trouble, but we certainly are aware that doctors made mistakes.
Yes, they do.
Well, no, I mean the doctors there specifically made mistakes that they did not pay for.
Right.
Right? And some of them were just, I don't think it was on purpose is what I'm saying. Poor judgment, maybe not trained well enough for some of these babies. I think that's certainly a thing.
Yeah, well, that's one of the key things in terms of the staffing of the unit.
Yeah, the people really didn't have the skills for some of the babies they were taking.
Right.
So Ian continues, Lucy's defense was very poor. The jury only really heard the prosecution's case. Her defense... Ben Myers KC, King's counsel, made a huge mistake by admitting pre-trial that insulin had been injected. This forced Lucy Letby to admit it had, but she could only say, I didn't do it. So the insulin was never sent to a secondary lab for testing. The insulin evidence should never have been used in court as evidence. Totally agree with that. What do you think?
Yeah, well, we talked about that.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, the measurements of insulin were something that you could use to get some information as to how much you needed to evaluate the child or how much further you needed to evaluate the infant. But it wasn't a test that could stand up to the court of law.
No, and the people who did the test said as much.
Yes, they did.
Yes, they did. So Ian goes on. What little evidence the prosecution had against Lucy Letby has now been shown to be wrong and deeply flawed. The chart spreadsheet, and we definitely talked about that, is wrong and a deception as it does not show all the deaths that happened when she was not on duty and no chart at all for the doctors. So that's a good point, Ian. I didn't think about that. They didn't have a chart of which doctors were on duty during these deaths.
Yeah, I wonder if one of them had been present for all.
I know. We don't know, right?
Yeah.
Because there were some doctors that were, like I said, I don't think any doctors were purposely hurting babies, but I really don't think that any nurses were either, including Lucy. So Ian goes on. Top leading statisticians are loudly speaking out about it, including the Royal Statistical Society. Lucy Letby now has a new defense team led by Mark McDonald, who is currently preparing a case to take to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, CCRC, and ask them to take it to the Court of Appeal, unfortunately neither of which acts very quickly. Because remember, she was already turned down to be allowed to appeal.
Yeah.
So they have to overcome that. And Ian continues, I'm sure you would agree that everyone deserves a fair trial. Lucy did not get a fair trial. She had a national witch hunt full of confirmation bias and the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. What's that?
That's sort of a way of explaining the confirmation bias. So the Texas sharpshooter is you got a person shooting a rifle at the side of a barn, and then after he's finished shooting, he goes up and draws a target around the ones that are closest together. So you have your result.
I see, yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
So Ian says the evidence was wrong, and also there are very many things the jury should have heard but did not, such as that the unit had a virus infection, faulty equipment, and the doctors had a very damning report from the RCPCH. And I think we did go over that in part 2 of our Lucy Letby coverage.
Yeah, we did.
The prosecution stated that the babies were stable and well. This is not true. They were very sick and should have been in a level 3 better unit receiving specialist care.
We said that.
Yep, we did. The babies died of prematurity, cluster of virus infections, and from the leakage of sewage pipes, sepsis, poor care, understaffing, and medical negligence by the doctors who have scapegoated Lucy. So this list of things are all factors to consider, but I don't know if we know for sure that each one of these things caused the deaths.
No.
But they're things that really weren't addressed as they should have been, I will say.
There's a lot of confounding factors here.
Yes. So Ian ends his email by saying, Lucy Letby never harmed any babies. Lucy's best friend Dawn Howe says Lucy would not harm a fly, which you can find on the good YouTube channel, Lucy Letby, The Case for Innocence. All Lucy's friends are standing by her and know her to be innocent. Best wishes, Ian. Well, thank you, Ian. Very insightful.
Very.
Yeah. Like I said, I believe that there was a problem with the training of the staff. There was a problem with the environment, the skill set, which I guess is the same thing as the training. But what else was found to be an issue that really wasn't addressed at Lucy's trial?
No, I think the biggest thing was how understaffed the intensive care nursery was.
Understaffed, and then the staff that were there really weren't trained as well. We did hear from some nurses in one of the documentaries we watched about how Lucy was being considered there as the most experienced.
Yeah.
When she'd only been there a few years.
She hadn't been there that long.
No. Right. And she was a very young nurse, didn't have much experience really at all. And a lot of the nurses who'd been there, 15, 20, even 30 years had been let go. And they'd hire new nurses because it was cheaper, basically, is what they were proposing had happened. So the article in The Guardian appeared in July of 2024, so a few months ago. And it discussed 5 areas that should have been addressed before or during the trial. The understaffed unit, like you said.
Yeah, we might be a little redundant here and there, but bear with us.
Yeah. So the NICU was woefully understaffed and should not have been accepting the sickest of newborns. When the apparent surge of deaths occurred, the hospital asked the Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health to consult. They found the NICU to be understaffed, and there were not enough senior consultants to cover both the neonatal unit and the pediatric unit. So that's a good point. It wasn't just the nurses who really weren't experienced or specialized enough. I think we determined that the vast majority of the physicians were pediatric and not neonatal trained.
That's correct.
And you even talked about that as a pediatrician yourself, that being a neonatologist is really a whole different can of worms.
That sure is.
Yeah, it's a very specific specialty. So also there were evidence concerns. Neonatologist Dr. Mike Hall was very well versed in the case, but he was never called by the defense to offer testimony. But I'm just thinking that is very strange to me, why the defense did not have their own medical experts.
Yeah, I don't know why at all.
I don't either. I haven't been able to find any reason why that failed to occur.
It doesn't look like there's any real defense put up.
No, there really wasn't.
So the article in The Guardian also said that one of the major prosecution witnesses, neonatologist Dewey Evans, actually changed his mind about how Letby had killed an infant only after he found out that she hadn't been present at the time of death of the baby.
Yeah, so basically saying that baby was murdered and then finding out Lucy wasn't there and saying, oh no, the baby died of this natural cause.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were back in the confirmation bias.
Yes, that's a big part of it. So with the insulin poisoning, much has been written about the measurement of insulin levels in 2 babies who were hypoglycemic. Several experts challenged the use of results from this type of immunoassay test as evidence of crime, including the forensic scientist, Professor Alan Wayne Jones, who's one of Europe's foremost experts on toxicology and insulin. So he's written about the limitations of immunoassay tests in criminal convictions, and he said they needed to be verified by a more specific analytical method to provide binding evidence in criminal cases. So how in the world that evidence of the insulin testing was allowed in her trial, I'll never understand.
You got me.
So with the air embolism, Dr. Dewey Evans testified for the prosecution, and he had stated an air embolus had been the causative factor in the deaths of 7 neonates. The air was either introduced through a nasogastric tube or in a vein. Neonatologists call this poppycock. I love that word, poppycock.
There are some other adjectives about that. Most relate to being poppycock.
Yeah.
So.
Huh. Well, yes, the whole part about putting air into the NG tube, that has been questioned by many experts.
Pretty much the prevailing opinion. I'm not sure of anyone who ascribes to the same theories as Dr. Evans.
Right. But he testified at her trial and came across as quite believable.
Yeah.
Because he did have a lot of experience, a lot of training, a lot of specialization that made him look like he knew what he was talking about.
Right. Although he hadn't practiced for many years.
Yes, that was a big part of what you found to be not a good thing.
No.
So, as far as the statistics go, most of us who have followed the trial are aware of the chart showing that Lucy Letby had been present at all of the deaths. So what the chart did not show was the 6 deaths that occurred when Lucy Letby was not there. Richard Gill, who has drawn much criticism for pointedly posting on social media during the trial that Lucy Letby's shift table was meaningless and that she had suffered a miscarriage of justice, was quoted as saying, "The police investigation and Crown prosecution made all the mistakes the RSS had warned about. Nobody studied the statistics in a professional way." So many problems with this case. I think it's going to take a long time, but I think something will have to happen. This can't stand.
I don't see how they can let it stand.
No, I don't either. So I just wanted to mention we got an email from David R., who gave us an excellent account of confirmation bias and how it works. But he did use himself and some health issues as the subject, so just on the basis of maintaining his privacy. I'm not going to go into it, but I do want to thank David because it was very helpful. It helped you to really kind of think about it a certain way. So any other comments on Lucy? I know we're going to just keep an eye on things because a lot's happening.
We'll keep watching.
Yep. Okay. So we have an email from Melissa P., and I'm going to let you read that one.
Okay. Hopefully my voice holds up. I've been listening to you two since 2018. Wow. It's very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a long time. And you are my favorite podcast. One thing I have been waiting for you is that you cover the Menendez brothers. Now it's become a popular topic again, so maybe this is the time. I really think that you two could do a lot with the family dynamics, and I'd love to hear your opinions on whether the sexual abuse is real, and if so, should that lessen their punishment? Also, this case has the aspect of women who fall in love with convicted killers and even marry them. Keep up the good work. Melissa from Kansas.
So thanks, Melissa. Of course, this is a case we've talked about. You really can't be following true crime and not talk about it.
Yeah, although we haven't done an episode on it.
We haven't, which is really kind of shocking because most of the really big cases we have covered. And this is a really big one.
Yes, it is.
And lately, there was that recent show on Netflix we watched about the Menendez brothers, which was kind of hokey, but I have to say I enjoyed the hell out of it. It was very entertaining. So they have been getting a lot of publicity lately, and that's mostly because of a filing to resentence them. And also a big social media movement, mostly on TikTok, supporting their release. So a lot of younger people who weren't around for their initial trial or the murders are really looking at this case and are on the side of the brothers. So in May 2023, the brothers requested a new hearing based upon an allegation that their father had raped former Menudo member Roy Rossello, who at the time was signed under RCA Records. Remember, the father, Jose Menendez, worked for the record company. He worked in the entertainment industry.
Yeah.
So this came out. And on April 18th, 2023, Rossello stated that when he was 14 years old, he was drugged and raped by Jose Menendez while he was visiting the Menendez family's home in New Jersey. So the appeal includes a letter that appears to have been written by Eric as well. This was written to his cousin back in 1998, and Eric talked with his cousin about the sexual abuse. So on October 3rd, 2024, Los Angeles District Attorney announced in a press conference that his office was reviewing this appeal. And later in October, the DA announced he was asking the court for a resentencing of this case. So if a judge agrees, the brothers would now be eligible for parole. A resentencing trial was initially scheduled to begin on December 11th, 2024, but then during a court hearing this past November, the trial was pushed to January 30th and 31st of 2025. So like just a couple weeks from now. So I would love to see what happens. We will keep a lookout on that, and I definitely would like to cover it. It's something, like I said, that we have discussed, and we've even discussed doing an episode about it, and we thought it might be something that requires more than one episode, which is always kind of a daunting task.
But now with all this newer stuff about how they might be paroled, it might be time to do the episode.
Right.
Once that decision is made.
Right. Yeah, I think so. So Lyle and Eric are married. They were married in prison to different women. Lyle actually was married twice in prison. Now, I don't know if this is true, but I was looking at the Wikipedia, and it said that Lyle was married in prison and then divorced the wife for cheating on her, and now has a new wife he married in prison. So how did he cheat on her if he's in prison? I don't know. That's something I'd like to know more about. But I've always thought I'd love to interview these wives. That's something that's like a dream of mine.
It's hard to understand how you could be in love with a murderer.
Right, yeah. Yeah, definitely. There are many women who fall in love with men in prison, maybe vice versa a little bit too, but it's definitely more women that are willing to do that than men. But when it comes to a murderer who's never going to get out, that's especially weird to me. So I would be fascinated not to put these women down at all, but just to hear their side of it. So I'll reach out again and see if one of them will talk to us.
Try that.
It would be great, yeah. Okay, so Lucy Letby we're keeping an eye on, and the Menendez brothers. So a lot happening with both of those cases, and I hope we'll be able to address them more in the future. Thanks, everyone, for joining us at The Quiet End today, and we'll see you next time at The Quiet End.
Come on down. Plenty of room.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.